Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for Understanding Fair Housing and Implicit Bias. Before we get started, we do have a few sponsors for you to share some information with you. First up, we have Carmen Lember with the Pinellas Finance Authority. Carmen?
Thank you. Good morning. This is Carmen with the Housing Finance Authority. In these unprecedented times, there's so much that has changed, but one thing that remains the same is people's desires to own homes, and that's where we come in. We're here to help first-time home buyers, and we want to let you know that our programs remain active and open, and our lending products continue to be strong. We cover Pinellas, Pasco, and Polk counties in their entirety. We help first-time home buyers, and the exception to that is veterans. Veterans do not have to be first-time home buyers. We do down payment assistance in the amount of $7,500. I believe that you'll be getting our general flyer about our program distributed to you today, as well as our list of lenders. If you have any questions, you can always contact me. I'll be happy to put my information out there in the chat for you, so you can email me or call me. I'm always here to help you and your clients. I hope you enjoy the class today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carmen. Can everybody go ahead and raise their hand for Carmen? Awesome. And if you guys have any questions, you guys can direct those to the Q&A. She'll be going over there to answer any questions you may have for her. And next up, we have Kimber Fraley with the Florida Building Inspection Group. Kimber?
Good morning, everyone. As she said, my name is Kimber Fraley. I'm a business development agent with the FBI Group, and we are a full-service residential and commercial home inspection company servicing Pinellas, Hillsborough, Pasco, Polk, Sarasota, and Manatee counties. So we're going to provide you with a one-stop shop for all of your inspection needs. And right now, of course, with all of the new COVID guidelines, we are following all of those. All the specifics of that, they're on our website, as well as if you call the number on my screen, which I can also provide you with the information in the chat. They can answer any specific questions that you may have in regards to that. And we're also going to provide you with same-day reports that are done thoroughly and properly every time. All of our inspectors are trained by a general contractor and are nationally certified. So we also offer free educational courses for agents that are both offered virtually and in person. I know right now most everything is virtual right now, which is why we've done some transitioning into those virtual classes. So if you have any questions on that, feel free to contact me. And I look forward to working with you all in the future. Enjoy your class today.
Thank you so much, Kimber. And let's go ahead and raise our hands for both of our sponsors and thank them for being with us here today. As you know, we wouldn't be able to hold these wonderful classes for you all without our sponsors. So thank you both for being here. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our presenters. We will have two presenters for you today joining us from the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights. First up, we will have Paul Valenti, and then following Paul, we will have Jeffrey Larick, who will be sharing lots of information for you. So let me go ahead and stop sharing this. And if you guys have any questions, you can still feel free to direct those to the Q&A for our sponsors. And Paul, if you're all set, you are ready to go.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Paul. I'm from the government, and I'm here to help. I love that joke. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. We too are still acclimating ourselves to this virtual learning environment. I prefer at least in-person trainings because there's an energy that you can feed off of in a room that you don't obviously pick up in these virtual trainings. But I hope that the quality of the presentation doesn't drop off too badly. Some wag might say, well, it wasn't much quality to start with, Valenti. And so, you know, touche, and good for you for raising that point. But I'm here today to talk to you about fair housing. And I'm going to share my screen and put up the PowerPoint that is from which we're going to lead this discussion. As you probably know, the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights is what is called in the legal world a FAP agency. That's a Fair Housing Assistance Program. That's an agency of state or local government which has a memorandum of understanding or contract with HUD to enforce the Fair Housing Act at the local level. And so as I move from the title screen to this is in part made possible by a grant from HUD. Really, that's for a conversation that I'm going to be leading next week, but this was the quickest PowerPoint slide I found. Let's start with governing law. So you'll recall this from your civics classes in school, political science classes if you attended a college, university. There are typically three levels, right, of government in the United States. There's the federal government, state government, and then typically local, county, or municipal government. And so fair housing laws emanate from those same three sources here in Pinellas County and in many jurisdictions if you're joining from outside of Pinellas. Obviously, Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968 is the Federal Fair Housing Act. As you see on the slide, it was enacted in 1968. The law itself had been languishing in Congress for several years. Other aspects of the Civil Rights Act had been passed prior to Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act. The Voting Rights Act had been passed. Title VII relating to employment discrimination had been passed. These all had been passed and enacted into law several years prior to the Fair Housing Act. With the assassination of Dr. King and the taking of his life, unfortunately, that was the necessary impetus to get the necessary votes to get the Fair Housing Act across the finish line to the desk of President Johnson and signed into law. There's also an analogous body of law under the Florida statutes, Chapter 760, the Florida Civil Rights Act. And then here in Pinellas County, we have Chapter 70 of our county codes. And both Chapter 760 of the Florida statute and Chapter 70 of the Pinellas County codes, the way the laws read under state and federal law, because we're, as I mentioned earlier, a FAP agency and have a memorandum of understanding with HUD, our law has to be what HUD terms substantially equivalent to the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so basically, our law has to be on all substantive levels equal to the provisions of the Federal Fair Housing Act. Or in fact, HUD would not allow us to be a FAP agency. So really the provisions of all three bodies of the law are largely the same. There are, however, some differences. And so as we move to the next slide, we'll discuss some of those differences and a popular misconception about the role our office or other civil rights offices play. A lot of people think that a civil rights office is a general fairness police. Anything and everything that's quote unquote unfair, you could come to our office and make a complaint about, and we'll conduct an investigation on your behalf. And that's simply not the case. One of the requisites, one of the requirements that we need to see in an allegation before we'd even accept a complaint for investigation is the person contacting our office has to suggest or state or allege, look, I believe I'm suffering not just a prohibited act, an unfair act, but it's being done to me or I'm experiencing this for a prohibited reason because of a membership in a protected group, protected class. This is the common language that's used in the trade. But really all it's trying to denote is groups of persons who by law are protected from discrimination. So as you'll see on the screen, under federal and state law, there are 7 protected classes, protected groups. Race is one. This is when in a live audience, I'd stop for a second and say, okay, now which race is protected from discrimination? And because you're all sophisticated folks, you'd all collectively say, well, all races, Paul, and you'd be correct. But some people in the public think, well, these laws only protect particular races. Simply not the case. Caucasian is a race? Yes. Does that mean Caucasians are protected from illegal discrimination? Yes. The prohibition is on race, not any particular race. So too with color. Color is also prohibited under state, federal, and local law. This is the part of the class where I'd stop and ask, well, what's the difference between one's race and one's color? Is there? And then again, because you're a sophisticated, savvy group of professionals, you'd all know, well, sure, two people could be of the same racial group, but have different issues of pigmentation, literally have different pigmentation, different skin tone. And that's what the class of color is designed to prevent discrimination against, so that you won't have intra-racial discrimination. If you think about it, if I'm African-American, Black, and I apply for a house, to buy a house from another Black person, and they refuse me because of my skin color, and I file a race claim, their first defense is likely going to be, well, we're the same race. What's the problem? Okay, then it's color discrimination. So to religion, that's prohibited. And any and all religions are protected from discrimination under law, including agnostics, atheists, secular humanists. Here's the bottom line, though. If you claim protection due to religion, the law does impose a sincerely held belief requirement. People ask, well, why does the law impose a sincerely held belief requirement? It's literally and simply designed to prevent folks from making up religious practices and beliefs that they don't really believe in. So the law does require, if you're alleging religion discrimination, you have to at least suggest that whatever belief system you have, it's sincerely held. Sex discrimination is illegal. Disability, national origin, and familial status, all illegal. We'll talk in greater detail about disability discrimination and the rights to request accommodation and modification due to disability. You'll see that handicap is put in quotation marks. We suggest to you that the preferred language when you refer to persons with disabilities is people first language, so that it's, someone is a person with a disability. It's not a disabled person. And handicap really is outdated language, we believe. But the reason it's there is that happens to be the language that was used in the statute in that disability was added. The protections for disability were added back in 1988. And so they still use what now is considered outdated language. So just a suggestion, don't use handicap. Person with disability is the far better term to use. National origin is, as you all know, the country in which one is born. Usually when I do this class, again, I'd say, hey, what national origins are protected from discrimination? And you'd all say, all national origins, and you'd be correct. And I go through that exercise because, again, there are some folks who might say, well, as a white male, I'm not. No. White male born in the United States. It's this simple. Let's say I happen to be a white male. I was born in the United States. I go to apply for a rental opportunity, and they deny me because of those factors. Would I have a claim of discrimination under the civil rights laws? Absolutely. You used my race, my color, where I was born against me. Doesn't matter that I'm a white male born in the United States. You used those illegal factors against me. So these laws are actually pretty broad and encompassing. Familial status is the presence or expectation of minor children. And familial status and disability were added to the Title VIII Fair Housing Act in 1988. Now, some of you might say, well, what about 55 and older communities? Wait for it. We'll get to those. So then you'll see those are the federal and state law protections. And that's the minimum amount of protections that every jurisdiction anywhere across the United States has to give you. Think about it this way. The federal law sets the floor of rights that you have. But localities can raise the roof, right? Can give you more rights than what federal law provides. They just can't give you less rights. So here in Pinellas County, our Board of County Commissioners have said affirmatively and by specification as to a protected group, has said, in addition to the federal ones that we have to protect because that's the law, we're also, as a matter of public policy, saying here in Pinellas County, you will not discriminate based on one's orientation. You will not discriminate based on one's gender identity or gender expression. There had been a large debate about whether orientation, identity, and expression fell under the federal protections. Until the last several years, the trend had been, no, they don't. Let me go back. But over the last several years, some district and circuit courts in the United States have started ruling, well, maybe when Congress used the term sex in the Civil Rights Act, under the Fair Housing Act, or Title VII, the employment discrimination, maybe they did mean concepts such as orientation, identity, and expression. In the employment realm, our Supreme Court just a couple weeks ago settled the question and said, yes, under Title VII, as it relates to employment, when Congress used the term sex, that includes the concepts of orientation, identity, and expression. Now that's employment. But I will tell you the reasoning or the rationale that the court used in engaging in the statutory interpretation, I believe lends itself well to Title VIII analysis and fair housing. So I wouldn't be surprised if you live in a jurisdiction that already has these protections, you're covered. Here in Pinellas, we're covered. City of Tampa, covered. Some other counties and jurisdictions in Florida. But if you're outside, if you're in Pasco, which doesn't affirmatively have this protection, it's probably likely in the next several years there'll be a challenge that makes its way to the Supreme Court under Title VIII. And if they follow the reasoning in the recent case they did relating to employment, I believe they'll hold and rule that there is protection under Title VIII for sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So let's move on. Actually, one last question on that past slide. So this is, again, a teachable moment for you all where we like to disabuse people of myths about what we do and when we get involved. So if we were in a live setting, I would ask, okay, and I'd pick one of you out and I'd say, let's assume you own an apartment building. And I come to apply for a rental opportunity. You happen to have been born in the Bronx. When you're born in the Bronx, there is one and only one baseball team for which you root, and that would be the New York Yankees. So you're a Yankees fan. I, on the other hand, and if you caught my virtual background, you'll see that I've got Fenway Park up there. So I'm a big fan of the Sox, right? And I come in wearing my Sox hat. And you see that hat and you say, whoa. There's no way I'm renting to a Red Sox fan. Would I have a viable fair housing complaint? And the answer, of course, is no, I wouldn't. Because nowhere in those groups that are listed on the screen is it enumerated that Red Sox fans are a now, I would say it's a religion, but the court, and believe me, that is a sincerely held belief. But the case law, unfortunately, is against me on that. You might say it's a disability, but then you invoke coverage, so you don't want to do that. The point is, not every unfair thing or unfair reason is an illegal violation of the civil rights laws. In most jurisdictions, typically one's political affiliation is not protected. What sports team you're a fan of. There's a lot of non-protected group reasons why a landlord can act against you, or a condo board, a homeowners association, that we all might agree is unfair, but under the Fair Housing Act would not be illegal. All right, now I am moving along. So let's talk real quick about the scope of coverage. The Fair Housing Act is actually broad in its coverage. It covers sales, rentals, lending and mortgaging, insurance, and that comes into play when we talk about accommodations for persons with disabilities and claims that, well, my insurance company, it's not me, I'm not the one doing this to you, it's the insurance company that won't let me do this. We don't think so. It also covers appraisals and advertising. So a lot of people think of the Fair Housing Act strictly in the context of either rentals, leasing, or sales. And of course, it applies there, but applies in far more expansive products and services relating to housing opportunity. So we mentioned how advertising, let's go over that real quick. Under the Fair Housing Act, it is illegal to make a notice or statement of preference or limitation based on one or more protected groups. A notice or statement of preference or limitation based on one or more protected groups. Let's start with a basic premise that while there are some exemptions to the Fair Housing Act or instances where it doesn't apply, we typically don't cover that in realtor training, because if you're involved in the deal, the act applies, notwithstanding what other exemption might have applied to the situation. The involvement of a real estate professional, a brokerage, an agent automatically invokes the act. But even if you might claim an exemption because a real estate professional is not in on the deal, there is no exemption to the advertising prohibitions. So it covers all housing transactions. You'll note that there is one exception to the advertising prohibition. Congress said, look, if you're in a shared housing situation, shared living quarters, roommates is what we're talking. And you want to have a preference based on gender or sex, that is allowed. So female to share apartment, that is legal. Black female to share apartment, illegal. Hispanic female, Catholic female, no. The exemption only relates to sex. Moreover, as you see in the next bullet, the prohibition is on notices or statement. A statement is literally that, a verbal utterance. If I simply say, I will not rent to Catholics, boom, I've just violated the Fair Housing Act's advertising prohibitions. And as the last slide shows, again, there are no exemptions to the prohibitions relating to advertising. Last note on the advertising, that obviously also applies to your MLS listings. So be careful in how you word your listings. We suggest that you discuss property and the community, not the demographics of the community in which, park nearby, sure. Near houses of worship, yes, because that's ecumenical, that's all inclusive. Near St. Brendan's Catholic Church, that might be problematic because that might be indicating a preference for Catholics. All right, occupancy standards. Can a landlord set reasonable occupancy standards? Well, there's a little tell on the slide. Apparently, yes, they may establish occupancy standards. However, the standard should be reasonable, and factors that we would consider would include square footage and the configuration of the residence in question, number of bedrooms, number and age of intended occupants. Here's how this would play out in the real world. Let's say you have a one-bedroom, 900 square foot apartment, and it's me and my wife and our handsome baby son, almost as good looking as his dad, if that's humanly possible. And we come to your leasing office where you have a one-bedroom, 900 square foot apartment, and we say we want to rent. And you say, whoa. I have a rule, 2 heartbeats per bedroom, 2 persons per bedroom. I see you, I see your charming, beautiful wife, and I see that devilishly handsome kid. That's 3 people. That's more than my rule allows. I'm not going to rent to you. I file a fair housing complaint. In that instance, who do you think is likely to win? I'm going to advise you now, likely it's going to be my wife and I and that handsome son of mine. Why? Because think about it. It's 900 square feet, which isn't huge, but it's certainly, look, it's a mansion in New York City, right? I mean, that's $5,000 a month minimum. Not huge, but it's me, the wife, and a little infant kid who, if we're honest about this, I'm going to just be sticking in the closet anyways. So is that really over-occupying a 900 square foot, one-bedroom apartment? No, it really isn't. And so your occupancy standard is likely going to be unreasonable and therefore a violation of the Fair Housing Act. If instead it was me, the wife, the 15-year-old, the 14-year-old, the 13-year-old, the 12-year-old, the 10-year-old, we skipped a year, the 9-year-old, and we wanted that same 900 square foot, one bedroom apartment, and you said no, you'd be on safe ground, obviously. And unfortunately in the law, a lot of times we can't give you a bright line that it's this way or not. This is what they used to say when I went to law school as a smell test. You look at these factors and then you give it a smell and you say, does that smell reasonable? Me, my wife, an infant child, 900 square foot, one bedroom. No, that doesn't seem a reasonable standard. Me, my wife, and this brood of the Brady Bunch. Yeah, that's overoccupied. And those are the factors on the screen that we would look at. Square footage, configuration, number of bedrooms. I think you get it. So moving on. Now we talked about familial status, and I just talked about the brood of the family that I have. And some of you are saying, whoa, 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 whoa. 55 and older communities, what are you doing to me? And it is true, of course, that there is a specific exemption in the law as it relates to familial status that allows for senior communities, 55 plus communities, etc. However, as I think you all know, there are 3 tests that such communities must meet in order to actually be 55 and older communities, senior communities. For 55 and older communities, one of the tests that must be met, and the one that we see fail the most, is that 80% of residences must be occupied by one person aged 55 or older. First off, notice the term there is residence, not ownership. It's not an ownership test. You could be 40 and own, and as long as you're renting to somebody 55 and older, you're going to be all right. So let's game this out a little bit, because we have cases every once in a while. This community has told me I can't have my grandchild live with me. And the defense comes back, well, we don't have to. We're a 55 and older community. Then we ask, well, do you meet the 80% rule? And every once in a while, we'll get back, say what now? And so we ask them, well, how many units do you have? How many residents have one person aged 55 or older? A lot of times our experience is that they don't even keep such records. And let me just take the time to say, you should census your communities and keep such records, just in case you get these very questions from offices like ours. But sometimes, as I said, they literally don't have that information. So let's say it's a 100-unit community. It's a mobile home park. They claim to be 55 and older, and there's 100 mobile homes. All right, you have no census of your community? Well, before the virus anyways. I'll send my investigator out, and we'll knock on doors. And let's say we knock on 100 doors, and 74 have one person aged 55 and older, 26 do not. What that means is you are not a 55 and older community. End of story. So again, we would recommend that you counsel your clients on conducting surveys, a census of the community in question to ensure that you're not going below that 80% threshold. The other 2 requirements to ensure that you are in fact a 55 and older community is you have to affirmatively indicate as such, and that's why you'll see that in most of these places as you go by, out front on their sign, it'll say 55 plus community. It says as much on the MLS listings that you compose. Their lot leases indicate 55 and older communities. I mean, their condo docs. Any way and every way that they communicate with the outside world, they should make the attempt to let the world know, hey, by the way, this is the type of community we are. And then the last test that they're supposed to do is each of these communities are supposed to register with the Florida Commission on Human Relations. That's the state's civil rights agency. My office takes the view that if that's the only, if you don't have 80%, you've got a problem. If you're not affirmatively indicating your community as a 55 and older community, you've got a problem. If you don't have 80 and you're not, well, you got real problems. If you're not registered with the Florida Commission, but you meet the other two prongs, I'm simply going to tell you, look, go register with the Florida Commission. So that's 55 and older, 55 and older communities. Let's move back to reasonable modifications and accommodations. So we had indicated earlier that persons with disabilities are a protected group, protected class under federal law. And in addition to being protected from affirmative discrimination, that is, somebody presents in a wheelchair to your leasing office and you say, oh, not going to rent to your wheelchair, you'll rip up the rugs. That's affirmative discrimination. That is, of course, illegal. But under the Fair Housing Act, persons with disabilities also have two request powers. They have the right to request modifications, reasonable modifications, and they have a right to request reasonable accommodations that will allow them to fully enjoy the housing opportunity in a similar manner as persons without disabilities. That's the right that they have. So let's take that up individually. Well, actually, let me go back one last time. Let's make a distinction between modifications and accommodations. Again, this is unfortunately where not being in a live setting stunts a little bit the training to be delivered, because we would engage in a conversation more and I would ask, what might be an example of a modification? And again, because you're a savvy crowd, you'd all say, well, a modification, Paul, that's structural in nature. You're talking ramps. You're talking extra widening doorways. You're talking grab bars and restrooms and showers. You're talking the location of electrical outlets and access to sinks and counters in a kitchen. And I say, man, this is a sharp crew, man, really sharp group, because of course you'd be right. As it relates to modifications, which again are structural in nature, the way the law provides is that the person with a disability has the right to ask for it. The question becomes, well, who pays for the modification? Again, I would survey the group in a live setting, and you'd all say, well, Paul, that depends. It depends upon whether or not there is federal funds coming into the housing provider. Are they getting low-income housing tax credits? Are they getting a direct subsidy from the federal government? If so, then the housing provider has to pay for the reasonable modification. If, however, it's traditional housing stock, then the person who asks for the modification pays for the modification. The trick, however, is the landlord, the housing community, homeowners association, condo board has to allow it. And how do we get back to 55 and older communities? How did that happen? Hey now. So that's modifications. Let's talk about accommodations. A reasonable accommodation is a request from a person with a disability to be accommodated to an otherwise applicable rule, regulation, policy, or procedure. An otherwise applicable rule, regulation, policy, or procedure. Can landlords, can homeowners associations, can condo boards establish rules, regulations, policies, and procedures? Of course they can. But what the Fair Housing Act says is a person with a disability may be entitled to an accommodation to those rules because of their disability to allow them to afford the full opportunity of housing. So what might that look like? Let's go back to that leasing situation that I discussed. One of you I would have picked out in the room owns an apartment complex. And I present to you with a I come into your leasing office and I present to you with a ferret in my hand, little ferret Bueller. Anyone? See, this is where the live audience would be so much better. Then I do my Ferris Bueller bit. It gets a big laugh, although it's also getting to be dated material because Ferris Bueller, the young kids in the audience would be like, well, what's that? Used to be a movie, kids. Used to be a movie. But anyways. And you say, well, I have a no pets rule. You can't have a ferret here. If I say I'm a person with a disability, and this is a support animal, so I'm asking for an accommodation to your no pet rule, that might be the basis for a Fair Housing Act. Can you as a landlord have a no pet rule? Of course you can. We see it all out to a condo board, homeowner associations. This is wholly legitimate. But I, as a person with a disability, have a right to be accommodated to that otherwise applicable rule, regulation, or policy or procedure. So we get asked all the time, well, what can the housing provider ask for as it relates to an accommodation request? And as you see on the screen, there are three things. Well, there's one thing, documentation, that a housing provider is entitled to that establishes three things. So you're entitled to documentation which establishes that the requester is in fact a person with a disability or disabilities. Because again, this right only accrues to a person with a disability. Me coming in and saying, I'm a Red Sox fan and I need Frankie to Ferret Bueller, it's not going to get me where I need to be. So one, the documentation must establish that it's a person with a disability. Two, that disability substantially limits one or more of life's major activities. What is a major life activity? You're a savvy group, you'd respond breathing, eating, walking, seeing, hearing, socializing. And I'd say that's right. Those are all major life activities. And then the documentation must show, and this is where a lot of our cases fall apart for a complaining party, that not only are you a person with a disability, not only does it substantially limit one or more of life's major activities, but there's a connection or nexus between your disability and the request. So that there's a logical connection between why you're asking for what you're asking as it relates to your disability. So if I come to you with a documentation that says, look, I have post-traumatic stress disorder, and it substantially limits the major life activity of sleeping because I get nightmares, and I need Ferret Bueller because he's a hell of a good-looking little guy and he makes my heart feel warm and happy. That's probably not going to be enough because making me happy in and of itself probably isn't the appropriate nexus or connection. If instead the documentation reads, I'm a person with a disability, it substantially limits PTSD, it substantially limits the life activity of sleeping, and when I have Ferret Bueller, I go to sleep at night and the nightmares don't come so I can enjoy a full night's rest. Now there's that connection, the nexus. Why is it that you need this animal as it relates to the disability? So you're entitled to that documentation unless, law is full of caveats and exceptions. You're entitled to this documentation unless the disability and the need for accommodation modification are readily apparent. Readily apparent. What does that mean? That's this. I come to your leasing office. I've got, well, you can't see it in the silhouette here, but I've got dark glasses on. I've got a white-tipped cane. I have a dog and a leash holster with a vest that reads Little Sisters of the Blind. In that instance, you shouldn't be asking me, say now, what's your disability and why do you need this accommodation? You should be able to tell that just in it's readily apparent in how I present to you what the situation is. I show up like this, it's readily apparent. One, I'm a person with a visual impairment. Two, it substantially limits my major life activity of seeing. And 3, that this dog guides me through the world and helps me navigate my way. So you know the whole story just as I appear. It's readily apparent. You don't be asking for documentation. Let's talk about that documentation just a little bit more. We get asked all the time, well, what kind of documentation is sufficient and from whom does it come? It could be a letter from a doctor. For us, the gold standard is a letter from a doctor that treats and has treated the person with disability. It could be a letter from a social worker. It could be a letter, remember I used the example of Ferret Bueller as a PTSD, sufferer of PTSD from service-related trauma. It could come from the Veterans Administration. The bottom line is, under the Fair Housing Act, it has to be reliable third-party information. That's the standard that we're looking for. Reliable third-party information. So we've seen a proliferation of certificates from a website. And the website is pretty much www.ipaid$30andgotthishere certificate.com. And we're asked, is that reliable third-party information? And we say, not in my book. If you think about it, how reliable is that? Here's what I reliably know from a website, www.ipaid$30andgotacertificate. Here's what I know. You had $30 and access to a computer and printer. That's what I know. Beyond that, I don't know how reliable any of it is. If instead, the person appearing before you, asking for the accommodation, gives you documentation from www.ipaid$300. I sent my medical history to a licensed medical professional in advance, of a Skype video conference of 45 minutes, at which there was an interaction and assessment individualized of me and my disability in need, upon which this certificate was issued, I think you'd agree with me that that's a lot more indicia or indicators or signs of reliability. And again, as with occupancy standards, it's hard to draw you a bright line of if it's this, it's good. If it's that, it's not good. Just know the more indicators of reliability, the more you should probably consider accepting the documentation. And let's say it comes from www.ipaid$30. Do you just say no and tell them to get out of your office? We would say no, because the Fair Housing Act contemplates what they call an interactive process. It's literally asking you and the person asking for the accommodation to have a conversation. And so in that instance, the conversation should probably be, well, I see this certificate. I appreciate your presenting it to me. The law does say, however, I'm entitled to reliable third-party information. This helps start a conversation, but I don't know that it's sufficiently reliable to tell me you're a person with a disability that substantially limits a life activity for which there's a connection or nexus between what you're asking of me and how it would allow you to enjoy this housing as a person with a disability. So can you get me something more, a little bit? Can you help me understand more? Get documentation that helps explain a little more that you are a person with a disability, that helps explain a little bit more what life activities are substantially limited, and helps explain a little bit more of that connection between your disability and why you're asking what you're asking. And we think you'd be on safe ground. So we see this always in the context of animals and no pet rules. And so, again, you can have an otherwise valid rule of general applicability that prohibits pets, but a person with a disability can request an accommodation from that rule for a service animal or emotional support animal, ESAs. And in that circumstance, the animal is not a pet. The animal is not a pet. It's an assistive device, a service animal, a support animal, not a pet. And even in a community where pets are otherwise allowed, but maybe you charge a pet fee, an additional security deposit, you do not do so when it relates to ESAs and service animals, because again, they are not pets. So HUD has issued new guidance on ESAs and service animals. New, it's about 6 months old now. But I would encourage you or your clients to go and visit the new guidance that HUD has issued. For several reasons. It's guidance from HUD, so it's always a good thing. But HUD actually did the right thing, in my estimation, by drafting it from the point of view of a housing provider. Well, if the person this, what can I that? You know, really from the point of view of the housing provider, property manager, condo board, and kind of helps walk you through a what if this, then that kind of a process to make it far more user-friendly than prior HUD guidance had been. So I would strongly, strongly encourage you to go to that guidance. It'll summarize a lot of what we've said here, but going at summarize, it actually goes into more detail. So let's talk about now, if in fact a person presents with a reasonable accommodation request, and they're either it's readily apparent what their disability and why they need the accommodation, or they've provided sufficient documentation. At that point in time, the law basically suggests, look, there are two and only two defenses to an accommodation request. One would be it's an undue financial burden, or the other would be it constitutes a fundamental alteration of my operations to afford that accommodation. So let's go back to Ferret-Bueller. If I have that letter from my VA counselor and it tells you that I've got the disability of PTSD, which substantially limits my major life activity of sleeping. But when I have Ferret-Bueller in my arms at night, the nightmares don't come and I sleep a full night, and that's why I need Ferret-Bueller. We now have a proper accommodation request with reliable third-party supporting documentation. At this point, you only have two defenses to that request. Will this constitute an undue financial burden to you? No. If Ferret-Bueller comes in, it's no real extra cost to you. Some in the room, if we were in a live setting, might say, well, what if the animal does damage? You can still hold me responsible for that, and we'll cover that. But does it, at the outset, request more money out of you? No, it doesn't. So one defense is gone. The only other defense, would it constitute a fundamental alteration of your operations? No. You're still in the housing business, so I'm not asking you to do anything different, so I don't know how this is a fundamental alteration of your operations. So on both fronts, you've got no defense. You're going to lose. Ferret-Bueller, welcome home. If instead, however, let's say I say to you, I'm diabetic. Here's reliable third-party documentation. But I'm also adverse to needles. This is a huge community. You have a maintenance guy on staff. Send your maintenance guy over to my apartment 3 times a day to give me my insulin shots. That's my accommodation request. Would you have to do that? And the answer here is, of course not. Why? Because that's a fundamental alteration. Your argument's going to be, look, I'm a housing provider. That's what I do. And this guy, he's trying to make me into a medical provider. That's not what I do. That's a fundamental alteration of what my operations are. You'd be right, valid defense. Got to move because I'm running out of time. Housing providers can hold persons with disabilities responsible for the damage caused by the service animal. That you don't charge an extra security deposit. We said that already. But, you know, Ferret-Bueller chews up your drywall. You have every right to take that out of my security deposit and or assess me if the damage is more than the deposit given. Housing providers can also take steps to protect themselves, the community, others from threats posed by a service animal or a support animal. But you got to be careful with this one because it can't be based on stereotypical concerns. It's got to be based on articulable events. Well, everybody knows a pit bull is dangerous, so you can't have a pit bull, direct threat. ADA and Fair Housing Act say direct threat, and therefore I'm fine. No, that's a stereotype about pit bulls and their ability to serve as a service dog or support dog. As opposed to, we've observed your pit bull lunging, nipping, tripping. Well, now you've got articulable events upon which you can hold the person with a disability to account for the conduct of their animal. And we would suggest that you don't say, and because we've observed that, you got to go. You take graduated progressive steps. Look, bring the animal under control. Fail to bring an animal under control. If you don't bring the animal under control, check this now, the animal has to go. Not you, the person with the disability, the animal. Now, 90% of the time, if the animal got to go, the person's going. But occasionally there may be a holdover, but the animal has to go. They still failed to bring the animal under control. Then we think you're in the right to say, hey, you know what? Now you got to go. So we would recommend you doing that progressive level of action against an animal, and only based on articulable events. Here, however, everybody with the virus, right? If you haven't seen this, who hasn't seen this? This is an example of clearly threat to self or others. The tiger, as well as the human, I think in this instance, is a threat to self or others. And so let me assure you, the Fair Housing Act does not contemplate housing providers, condo boards having wild tigers in an apartment community, a condo community, et cetera. That's not what we're asking for. Real quick, the Fair Housing community, the Fair Housing Act of the LGBT community, we actually covered this when I suggested I think the Fair Housing Act is going to ultimately be read to cover the LGBT community because of recent case law in the employment realm. But in Pinellas County, it doesn't matter. Our law specifically says one protected group is identity, orientation, and expression. So it's covered here, it's covered, and even if it's, although again, I think it's going to be ruled to be covered under the Fair Housing Act, there are still case law that talks about traditional stereotypes as a form of gender discrimination. So, you know, I'm kicking you out because you just don't act like a woman, you dress like a man. And well, that's a stereotype based on gender that even if it's questionable whether under federal or state law, orientation or expression is covered, because you've now used gender stereotypes like that, there's probably a basis for coverage under the Fair Housing Act. But I think that the tides of history are bringing us there anyways, I suspect. Lastly, criminal background checks. So everything we've been talking about so far is generally fallen under disparate treatment. There are two forms or theories of discrimination. Disparate treatment, disparate being different, right? Different treatment. But there's also a theory of law called disparate impact, which suggests that, look, a law on its face may be neutral, but in its impact affects one group more than another. This, if you remember your history, goes back to the Equal Rights Amendments, in part at least, in the 70s, where you would have, in the early 70s, you'd have police departments and fire departments with rules that might read, look, to be a police officer, you have to be 6 feet tall and 180 pounds, minimum. Now, on its face, that's not saying you can't be a police officer and be a woman, but in its impact, that tends to rule out more women in a disparate impact than it does men. And so those kinds of requirements were challenged, found invalid for the disparate impact. So too as it comes to housing and criminal convictions. For a host of reasons that I'm not going to go into, although there'll be some conversation when my colleague Jeffrey follows on implicit bias. In the United States, the criminal justice system disparately impacts minorities than whites. And because of that, a per se bar on if you have a criminal conviction, you can't live here, is going to have a disparate impact on protected groups of Blacks, Hispanics. And because of that, a per se rule can be challenged. And so we would say a couple things in this regard. Don't have a per se ban on convictions. And as a threshold issue, make a distinction between a conviction and an arrest. An arrest at the end of the day is just a suspicion of criminality. Without a conviction, an arrest really, in America, we're presumed innocent until proven, right? So an arrest is, at some point, law enforcement suspected that perhaps this person violated the law, but it was never proven by a conviction. So clearly we think arrest records should be out. But even with convictions, you should conduct an individualized assessment. How long ago was the crime? What was the underlying crime? Was it a crime of violence versus a crime of possessory drugs versus a crime of financial fraud? What efforts at rehabilitation have been undertaken? Have they established themselves since as a solid member of our community? These are the things that we would suggest that you look at. And then we say individualized look. Each look should be individualized, but then kind of be consistent within that individualization. So what I'm suggesting here is, well, here's a white applicant, and he was arrested for pot distribution 20 years ago when he was in college. What a crazy kid, smoke weed in college. Let him in. Here's a black gentleman who was in college and smoked a little pot and had a possessory distribution. Hey, whoa, we don't want dealers in the name. Well, it's the same thing, but one's white, one's black. Actually, we've now crossed into disparate treatment, right? But be consistent. HUD's come up with a new proposed rule on use of criminal background checks. The bottom line is, because I'm really running out of time, is if the HUD rule gets adopted and housing providers, condo boards, et cetera, use third-party providers that use algorithms to make an assessment on risk factor, I read the HUD rule to say that's probably going to be okay and not found to be discriminatory. Even though we in the field believe it still could have a disparate impact, the HUD rule suggests, well, whatever. And so that's all. This will be made available to you. I don't want to go into too much detail as this is where the proposed rule, because it's really technical, spells out multiple standards that got to be established. But again, the crux of it is really go use a third party that you could point the finger to. I had no input on it. I gave it off to that third party. They used whatever algorithms they used, and that's what we came up with. And then the bottom line is, if that rule is adopted, I think disparate impact claims will be far harder to plead, prove, and prevail upon, whether in our office or in a court of law. So I think I brought it in right at an hour. I'm going to stop sharing the Q&A. Other than disjointed thought process here. If this were a live audience, we'd say Q&A. It's a little harder in the virtual realm. I'll go look in the Q&A and or the chat to see if there are any questions and answer them if I can. You see my name and my contact information on the screen. If you were to ask Pro, how much did the Office of Human Rights charge you today for this? They'd tell you why nothing at all. So too, if you're within Pinellas County and you want us to conduct fair housing training, whether it's your condo board, your homeowners association, your brokerage wants to do fair housing training, you're a part of a community group. I mean, really, you want to hear about fair housing training, we'll do it, and I'll do it free of charge. If you're outside of Pinellas County, I'll probably do it. It won't be free of charge. I'm going to have to charge you for mileage. I'll have to hold the taxpayers here in Pinellas harmless from the cost of paying my mileage to go to you to do that training. But even there, I hope you'll agree that it'd be worth paying the minimum of mileage costs. So I've said a lot. I'm going to stop sharing. I said I'm going to stop sharing. And I hope my colleague Jeffrey Lorick is standing by. I see a blank screen, Jeffrey. Yes. And now, so I'm going to yield the floor to our moderator and or my colleague Jeffrey. I hope you enjoyed our time together. I try to make it fun, less participatory than I'd like. But if you enjoyed this at all, buckle up. You're really going to enjoy Jeffrey. So, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate it very much. And as always, you do very informative, thoughtful, and entertaining presentations. So thank you for that, sir.
Thank you. Good luck.
Yeah. We're going to turn it over to our moderator at this time to provide a break. If you would, is Diana on the Zoom
Yes,
platform?
sir, I am.
Yeah.
How long would you like to do a break for? I didn't realize we were doing a break.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard because my training will be almost 2 hours long. So we want to provide a 5-6 minute break. Does that make sense?
Okay, I hope everybody had a good break. We are now going to begin the second part of the program. I would like to introduce to you Jeffrey Lork, who is also with the Pinellas County Office of Human Rights. So Jeffrey, if you're ready, you can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you very much. Like the previous presenter, we normally do these live presentations, but given the new norm, which all of us are still getting used to, we are learning how to provide these trainings over this platform, Zoom. I hope that all of you are safe and doing well, and I thank you for taking a little bit of your time today to look at unconscious bias. It's how do we recognize it, disrupt it, is some of the things that we'll go through today. We also try to tailor this training to you in line with what you do as a living, as a realtor. And so we try to tailor it so that it relates to the work that you do. But how we look at the world oftentimes and each other is informed by perpetuations of unconscious stereotypes and assumptions, bequeathed to us by our history and amplified daily by culture and media. Recognizing unconscious, implicit, and explicit biases that all of us harbor, there is a need for an understanding, probably more than ever in our history, how these are imposed on each of us, the lenses and through which we view others in our community. How do we remove these lenses are a necessary first step if we are to move forward together as a community and as a nation. And so with that, I'm going to share with you this video, Overriding Biases and Barriers to Fair Housing. This is a video that is actually prepared by, distributed by the Realtors Association. It's an hour long, but we're only gonna watch about 6 minutes of it, and then we'll continue with the training. And let me know if you can't hear it or if there's some issue.
Hi, Richard. It's great to finally meet you virtually after all the emails we've exchanged. I'm really excited that you like the Whiting Way house. It's one of the nicest properties I have. We've been getting a lot of interest, as a matter of fact. I don't know if you have kids, but it's in one of the best school districts in the area.
Yeah, it looks perfect. Wait, hold on just one more second. Got it. There we go. Hi.
Hi! Great to finally see you.
Oh, yeah, you too. So again, we love the house and we're really interested.
I'm so glad. That's just really great. And listen, I should say right up front that we also have some terrific properties in some other neighborhoods you might like to see, in case this one isn't a good fit.
How would it feel to be really excited about living in a certain neighborhood, and then to have a real estate agent tell you, I think you'll be more comfortable somewhere else? How do we do this work without being nervous all the time? Hi, my name is Rachel Gotzel. I'm a law professor at Rutgers Law School and the co-founder and co-director of the Perception Institute. The Perception Institute is a consortium of researchers and content experts For 10 years, we've been focused on bringing insights from the mind sciences to judges, healthcare providers, teachers, and many others who are concerned about being fair, doing their jobs correctly, treating everyone well, and yet who often feel like they're not quite sure if they're doing the right thing. We're really excited to be here with the National Association of Realtors to share with you insights from the mind sciences to support the work that you do. Your job, your role of guiding people to find homes is equally as important as any of the groups we've worked with. Frankly, right now, in the time of COVID-19, your work is more important than anyone else's. Our homes are our shelters, our refuges. And finding a home where we can keep ourselves and our families safe, nothing is more important. As real estate agents, you're often told what not to say.
Wow, that wasn't supposed to happen. 1 second.
You're often told what not to say, but you don't necessarily know what to say. The mind sciences offer a set of tools and strategies for you with your colleagues to determine how to move forward in a way that builds your business, ensures that people feel like they're being fairly treated. So again, it's a way to align your behavior with your values, consistent with the Fair Housing Act. And this is an exciting time to share this information with you because again, during this time of COVID-19, nothing could be more important than making sure that people feel like they're being treated fairly as they look for their homes. In this film, you will learn why we need to understand our implicit biases, our brain's automatic association of stereotypes or attitudes with particular groups. Biases can lead us to treat people differently based on their identity, leading to discrimination without our even knowing it. This film will give you tools to help override the effects of implicit bias. This means that the next time you work with clients from other cultures and backgrounds, you will be in a position to provide equal professional service because you have embraced the work we all need to do to treat everyone fairly. Real estate agents as guides and gatekeepers. As real estate agents, you know more than anyone else that the role you can play can either be a guide or a gatekeeper. And one of the risks is that you're guides to some and gatekeepers to others. So I have my own story to tell about my experience with real estate agents. For the most part, my experience has been fantastic, and that's not surprising. Why isn't that surprising? Because I'm a white female, I'm a law professor, I have a white husband, and when I was 6 months pregnant and we were looking to purchase our home for the first time, the real estate agents couldn't have been more lovely. I've had one experience that was a little bit different. When Jim, my now husband, then boyfriend, and I were first moving to New York from Michigan, we were looking for an apartment. I went out with the real estate agent and was shown several places, and then was shown one. It was beautiful. It had amazing light and great moldings and French doors. I was really excited. I called Jim and told him to meet me at the real estate agent's office. As I got there, I started filling out the forms. And as I was filling out the occupations, the real estate agent looked over my shoulder and she said, "Your husband's a legal services lawyer? They're not going to rent this to you." Luckily for me, because I was devastated, I love this apartment and I was so surprised. Luckily for me, Jim walked into the door and she looked at him and she said, "Those eyes would never sue anyone. I'll make a call." We got the apartment. So my sister had a very different experience. She's also white. Her husband, neurobiologist, is black. When they were looking for their first apartment, they moved to Palo Alto. She, like me, went out with the real estate agent and was looking for an apartment. She found one that she loved. She called her then boyfriend to meet her at the real estate agent's office, and he did. They were very polite, the folks at the office. But then when they got home, they got an email that said the apartment had already been rented. But they looked down through the scroll of the internal emails and they saw a message internally that said, if they saw him, never would happen. They didn't get the apartment.
What do you see? Most of you probably said you saw a frog. As we look at this image a little further, a little longer, wait for it. Now, what do you see? Some of you may still see a frog, but there will be others who said there's a horse. And that's how implicit bias and unconscious bias affects us. We normally make decisions based on a snapshot, a brief moment of interaction with someone, and we think that we can begin to then place them in categories. So why are we having this conversation? Why are you're sitting and spending some time this morning in some diversity training? First of all, let me inform you, if you've been involved in diversity training before, implicit bias training before, let me assure you, this isn't that training. This is the most real world, real life training that you will ever be involved in, or that you will hear. This training I have been doing for over 10 years. And so even though there are a lot of things that are happening in our country right now, this presentation has been uninfluenced by what's going on out in society right now. This has been a long-standing history. And so if we're going to deal with race, diversity, culture, then we have to be able to be willing to have some difficult conversations and go places that other folks aren't really comfortable going. So we're going to go there today. So why do we need to have these conversations? We live in a diverse, multicultural world, but frankly, we just haven't been taught the skills how to communicate effectively over social lines, racial lines, and cultural lines and lines of unequal power. We have not been taught the tools to be able to have those difficult conversations, which is being played out all over the country right now. We haven't had those conversations, and this led us to a pretty peculiar situation today. In fact, this is most of our approaches when it comes to diversity, inclusion, equity, and treating everyone fair. We much rather just bury our heads in the sand and act like there is no issues in terms of culture, diversity, and inclusion. We really rather just ignore it. But like I said, if we're really going to have a conversation today, we have to understand the complicated history of race, class, and real estate in this country. Excuse me. When we look at this 20th century landscape of inequities, we must understand historical drivers in which created it. Throughout the formation of this nation, since its almost inception, every ethnic group, every racial group has been marginalized as our country tried to find its way. So let's talk about that history. When this country was set up by our framing fathers many decades ago, a lot of it was built on structural inequities. And those structural inequities that were built into the system that none of us are accountable for, are responsible for instituting those structural inequities, has made it difficult for certain folks to have different experiences to access. As you heard in the realtor video, she gave a couple of examples of how different people have different experiences to access. And oftentimes, those different experiences are based on nothing more than biases and perceptions. If you remember the realtor video, that's exactly what she was saying was going on. And because of that, you've heard from the earlier trainer, from my director, Paul, that has had a disparate outcome on certain groups of people. You're going to learn a little bit about Jeffrey today, and I hope you don't mind, but I share some personal stories that you might be able to really understand what it is that I mean when I say structural inequities and folks having different experiences to access. I am a fifth generation hairdresser. Yes, I am a hairdresser. I can curl, cut, dye, and perm hair with the best of them. I actually own my own business for some 36 years, and I sold it before moving here to Pinellas County to take the job here at the Office of Human Rights. But as a young person, with a license to do hair. I actually got it in the day after I received my high school diploma. My father was a hairdresser, and while I was home for the summer, I worked with him until I went to school in the fall. When I went to school at Indiana State University in Terre Haute, Indiana, I went to work in a salon in that community for a while. And after a few years, I wanted to open my own business to be like my father. So I went to Indiana State University Business School. They helped me develop a business plan. At the end of developing that plan, they was extremely excited for me to go out to the community to secure funding to start my own business, because I had good credit, I had a work history, I had history with the banks, and I had a solid business plan to present to financial institutions to secure monies to start my own business. I went to 7 banks in my community, and I was denied by all 7. And when we were developing the business plan, the business school said that don't worry if they deny you their product, they have to make minority loans available for you. And so when I asked about those minority loans, they said, I'm sorry, but you first have to qualify for our product before we can introduce you to minority loans. So obviously, to these loan officers, what was ever in that business packet didn't speak to them as much as some other things that might have been at play. And they were based on nothing but biases and perceptions. For some reason, they believed that I would not be a viable candidate to make a loan. And the most interesting thing about that, 2 of the banks that denied me were banks that had given me loans for vehicles, more money than I was asking to start my own business. And so I wrote letters to those banks saying to them I did not understand why I would not qualify for a business loan given our history together. I was invited to come back in by those 2 banks saying, okay, we can do the loan. I'm like, fantastic, great. And so after we completed the loan process, the loan officer pulled the letter that I had written to the bank saying that I didn't understand and asked me, now that we've satisfied this loan, would you be willing to write a letter of rebuttal to this letter that you had mailed to us? Of course, I didn't. But the thing that I'm trying to make, it was different folks have different experiences to access. And so I called my colleagues in the community who were a different race of me. And I asked them if they had any difficulty securing loans from lending institutions in our community. They said, no, are you kidding, Jeffrey? We could call down to the bank this afternoon and tell them we need $60,000, and they'll tell me it'll be ready by the end of the day, and all they need is a signature. So I'm talking about structural inequities that were in place in this country long before any of us got here that has made it possible for different folks to have different experience to access. And I'm talking about lending, housing, education, etc. And a lot of those differences were not based on anything other than biases and perceptions. And so it's had a disparate outcome on certain communities. Segregation never comes about just because it is, as the term de facto might suggest. The bottom line is this, that segregation has always involved some form of institutional, organized, human intentionality to those institutions who have always depended on a more broadly held beliefs, ideals, and customs for the purpose of sustaining their power. Baldwin says this, not everything that is faced can be changed, but watch this, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This is what they call a cultural competency continuum. And this is as academic as I'm going to get today. At the low end, you will find somebody who is destructive to the culture. This is the individual who holds the ideal that and acknowledges that there's only one way of being and purposely denies and outlaw other cultural approaches. Cultural incompetency supports the concept of separate but equal, marked by the inability to deal personally with multiple approaches and a willingness to even accept they exist. And I thought we got over that Brown versus the Board of Education. Cultural blindness is this. It's an individual who falls to the assumption people are better works for one member or one culture should work within all cultures. This is the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstrap. Dr. King says this, that first a person has to have a set of boots. This is cultural pre-competence, which is why I hope that I've been involved and asked to participate in this training. This is to encourage learning and understanding of new ideas and solutions. Watch this, to improve our performance and the services that we provide. Cultural competency involves actively seeking advice and consultation and committing to incorporating new knowledge and ideas and experience in a wider range of practices. And someone who is proficient holds cultural differences and diversity in high esteem and proactively regards cultural differences and the promotion of improving culture and relationships among diverse groups. And I know that all of us fundamentally believe this, that we should work to create a just and inclusive society, watch this big word, where all people have an opportunity to succeed. How big is all? I'm glad you asked. It's the immigrant communities. It's the disabled communities. It's the LGBT communities. We need to work where all members of our society have an equal opportunity to succeed. What kind of stands in the way of that is a story, again, related to me in my own life by this penny. As you can see, this penny has been through some things. And this was a true story. I was standing in worship service on one Sunday, and I reached into my pocket and I pulled out a penny that looked a lot like this penny. And as I looked at the penny and observed the penny, I said to myself, I wonder what this penny has gone through to end up in this condition. And I dropped the penny back in my pocket, and I was impressed to go back into my pocket and pull that penny out again. But this time I pulled out this penny. And what struck me in that moment was, despite how different those two pennies looked in appearances, they both had the same value. And too many times inside of our organizations, inside of our businesses, inside of our communities, folks are being discounted, watch this, by what they look like on the outside. And if we don't have the basic concept that all folk have value, then we miss something really important. And I'm telling you, as I go out and present this training to corporate America, institutions of higher learning, or community groups, I often hear from minority participants that how they have been made to feel like they did not have value inside of their communities or organizations. And again, I know what that feels like on the first hand, because as a young college student, I was a first generation college student to go away to college in my entire family. I'm from a family of 5 brothers and sisters, single head of household, and I know that my mother did not have the funds or resources to send me to college. So I was fortunate and blessed enough to earn a football scholarship, an athletic scholarship to play football in college. And for most young people my age, that was merely an opportunity to play football in college and then go to the NFL and lift my family out of poverty. There was only one problem. When I went to college, I wasn't that good. And I found that out because these athletes from around the country were simply amazing, and I struggled to keep up with them. So needless to say, I didn't play in many of the games. Well, if I'm going to be honest, I didn't play in any of them. I was relegated to the scout squad, helped our team get prepared to meet the opponent. And so if any of you have been athletes before, you know, before you go out to practice, you have your ankles taped, your wrist taped. So this day I go into the training room to the trainer who typically takes my ankles, and he was taping the knee of our All-American, All-Star, 4-year starting offensive guard. And so I asked this trainer, How long would he be? And our All-American 4-year starting offensive guard says to me, you have to wait your turn inward. Now, I'm an inner city kid, ain't got no money, and I know the only reason I'm in college is on this scholarship. So I go into the office of the one person who has the authority to do something about the situation. It was the same guy who sat on my mother's couch and promised her that if I chose his institution, that he would take care of her son, the head coach. So I go into the head coach's office. I say, Richard just called me the N-word. And here's how my head coach responded to me in that moment. He stared at me. And he stared at me some more. And he stared at me some more. And it dawned on me that he wasn't going to do anything about it. So I backed out of his office very slowly. I closed the door. And when I got the door closed, it was like somebody kicked me in my gut and knocked all of the wind out of me. And in that moment, I said, wow, that's what it feels like to be devalued as a person for something you have no control over. Obviously, our All-American starting guard didn't feel like that I had much value. My head coach didn't find that I had much value because he felt no reason or compelled to come and provide aid for me. And so I want you to be mindful of that. That is, when you engage folks who are different from you, I want you to understand that despite how different they might look from you, how different that they present to you, that they all have value. And if you just get a hold of that from this training, we're going to be a whole lot better off. Oftentimes when we look at training, diversity training, inclusion training, and equity training, we have always focused on diversity. And diversity in this acronym is spelled out this way: different individuals valuing each other regardless of skin, ideology, talent, or years. Diversity. And we have focused on diversity. And if everybody was on this Zoom meeting was of the same gender, of the same race, or of the same age, we would still have diversity, because they would be diversity of generation, diversity of thought, diversity of experience. And so diversity really isn't the issue. It's really about this. It's about inclusion. The achievement of a society in which, watch this, all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully and have equal access to opportunities and resources. It is literally this. It is the deliberate steps that we take to make the mix work. What actions do we deliberately make and take to make the mix work? That's what it's really all about. It's really about equity. Again, it's a just and a fair inclusion into society where all may participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. It is about equity. And if you notice the diagram, it is not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Sometimes the environment may need to be customized so that folks can feel involved, appreciated, and can reach their full potential. We must all acknowledge that all of us carry unconscious bias. But get this, it does not make us bad people. It simply makes us human. And there's really two forms. There is the explicit bias. That's someone who is completely aware of their biases. They may express them directly in terms of what their preferences are, as my director did earlier, his preference for a baseball team, and they operate in that consciously. The more dangerous one is implicit bias. It can be expressed indirectly. A person may be completely unaware of when those biases are in fact affecting their interactions and understanding. And because it operates in the subconscious. So what is bias? If we were in a live setting, I would ask for your interpretation of what that is. Because we're not, I'm gonna give you a hint. It's an evaluation, a belief, a disposition that can be either favorable or unfavorable. It can be positive or negative. How do we define it then? It's an attitude or stereotype, watch this, that affects our understanding, our actions, and our decisions in an unconscious manner. My director and I had the privilege of recording a television program to talk to how to gain access to housing. It was actually an organization that would provide housing opportunities. And the host of the show asked at the end of the recording, can you think of any possible topics that we might be able to bring on this topic of gaining access to housing? And I said to the host at the time, have you ever thought about having conversations with the immigrant communities on how difficult it is for them to secure housing? And this was their response to me. Oh, we first have to be so careful that they're legalized citizens of this country. And I said to the person, I never said anything about undocumented citizens. I hope you see what I'm putting down. It affects our actions and our understandings and our decisions in an unconscious manner. And oftentimes they will surprise us when that shows up. Because when someone of the Latinx goes into that community, what's going to have to be the first hurdle that they're going to have to get over? That's right, whether they're legalized citizens of this country. Is that a threshold for every other person who walks through the door to receive those businesses, services? No. So when you came into this training today, here's what you brought with you today. You brought your life experiences, your expectation, your educational levels. And as a result of all of that, you also brought in, which you may not be aware of, is your implicit biases, our cultural conditioning, and implicit associations. Implicit biases are rooted in how our brain works, and no one is immune. Our brain receives thousands and thousands of data points a day, and our brain is constantly mapping and creating shortcuts. Our brain is hardwired to take shortcuts. Our brains have evolved mental shortcuts to help us navigate a myriad of decisions that confront us every day, seemingly automatically. You don't have to think about sitting down in a chair. When you approach a chair, your mind has already figured out that you need to sit and how to sit in that chair. So those mental shortcuts help us navigate a myriad of decisions that confront us every day. Again, seemingly automatically. The subversive nature of the unconscious thought is revealed, watch this, by what we call default assumptions. Default assumptions are those strategies that the brain uses to judge the most likely interpretation of ambiguous situations. Our prehistoric ancestors had to make a decision real quick. Is that dinosaur going to be my dinner or am I going to be its dinner? So the brain had to develop shortcuts so that they wouldn't have to stand there and get eaten. And so this default assumptions are one strategy that the brain uses to help us understand that the human brain is a finely tuned decision-making machine that is designed to make quick judgments on a wide variety of confusing events. And we'll unpack that a little bit more. This becomes an example of that. If you would just take a few minutes and read this, it tells you how powerful the mind is. As you finish reading this, it's amazing. I was trying to tell my 8th grade spelling teacher this, but she just wasn't buying it. How many triangles do you see? If we were in a live training, we would hear numbers at 6, 8, 12, 11. And then I would say, how about this? None. Because what does it take to make a triangle 3 solid sides? But because of the default assumptions of our minds, they often fill in the blanks for us. In this image that you see on your screen before you right now, comes from a movie. called The National Treasure. The actor there, Nicolas Cage, if you notice, has a funny set of glasses that have multiple sets of lenses associated with it. And what Nicolas Cage was in pursuit of was the national treasure. And the national treasure just happened to be hidden on the back of the Constitution of the United States of America. And it wasn't until he was able to line up these lenses just right that he was able to discover the clues to the hidden treasure. My point is this, that all of us go through life looking through a certain set of lenses. And those lenses can affect our interactions with other folk. They could be the lenses of religion, sexual orientation, gender, race, economic status. There are multiple lenses that all of us wear that can affect our interactions. And until we learn how to look through another set of lenses, we might not understand what it is to look or see the world through somebody else's lenses. Let me give you an example. The building that I work at on 400 Fort Harrison has a 5-inch curved step up. I'm gonna use this word because I can't think of anything, a better word right now. I see able-bodied people stepping over that 5-inch curved step up like it isn't a problem, that it is like it isn't even there. And they do it seemingly with no effort or no thought. One morning I get to work and I see a person on a walker who is looking at that 5-inch step up and they saw it as an obstacle. And I began to see how they were processing in their mind how they were going to get over this obstacle. And so the person took their walker and they put it on the curb and they steadied it and make sure it was solid. They placed one foot on the curb and they heaved themselves up on the curb and they took a huge exhale like, whew, I got over that hurdle. But because many of us who don't see through the lens of the disabled community might not understand how that might be a hurdle to someone from that community. But check this. It is the disabled community who advocated for curb cutouts. And is there anybody on the Zoom meeting who haven't taken advantage of a good curb cutout? I know I have. I ride a bike and I can't jump a curve like I did when I was a young person. So I've used a curb cutout. I saw a mother jogging with her babies in a stroller, and guess what she used? A curb cutout. My point is this. It is the disabled community who advocated for curb cutouts. But does the curb cutouts just benefit the disabled community? No, they benefit all of us. And when we gain the ability to look through another set of lenses, what might other people be able to contribute to improve the environments in which we go, that we live in every day? So I'm just simply going to ask you a question. How do you see the world? What are your lenses? Through your profession, through your gender, through your race, your ethnicity, your orientation? Let me ask you another question. Might you just need a new perspective? And that's all that we're trying to do today, is broaden our understanding and give us another perspective to view things from. Here's the challenge. Your challenge is this: to create an open and productive discussion where people feel safe in sharing their experiences, their perspectives, and being receptive to learning. Being open to trying different approaches. Different people, we understand, feel safe in different ways, depending on cultural backgrounds, experiences, and expectations. But dialogue is meant to be open-ended, that you might be able to express your experiences, your viewpoints, and perspectives, and be willing to learn from someone else. Here's a really important point. Shared learning is the goal, not winning an argument. Shared learning is the goal and not winning an argument. Because we have the tendency to make decisions based on what we already know have experienced or analyzed a situation through the lenses of our prior experiences, information, and interaction. Something that impedes that discussion, this author says this: we really don't see through our eyes or hear through our ears, but it is through our beliefs. And when a person is asked to put their beliefs on hold or put their beliefs on hold, they believe that they are being asked to cease to exist as they are. And that's not really what it's all about. What it is really about is learning what it is to look through another set of lenses. It is the only way to learn what it might feel like to be somebody else. And when we gain that kind of empathy, then it might be a way to start the dialogue. There are a few activities that we would put you through in a live scenario, and those have been cut way down for the purpose of this training. And I wish you could go through them because they're actually quite exciting. So what we're going to do now, and if you were in a live training, each of you would have colored sheets of paper with these particular racial groups on them. And then what I would do is read stereotypes. I would read implicit associations with each racial group. This is really difficult for a lot of people, this exercise, because we really don't want to believe we know this stuff. We know it doesn't necessarily lead our interactions the way that we do, but they are present. So I'm going to read some stereotypes from the first racial group. And when you believe you have that racial group in mind, well, we can't do it because we're not live. You could raise your hand on there or on the chat or anything like that. But here is the first racial group: NASCAR loving, privilege, lacks rhythm, racist, elitist, loves country and Western music, rednecks. How many of you, when we read those implicit associations, thought of? Probably a great number of you. I'm gonna read another set of implicit associations. When you believe you have the racial group in mind, let me know. Here it is. Scientifically and mathematically gifted, respects for elders, a closed society, not often accepting of others, very driven in ambitions. How many of you thought of Asian American? So the next group: lazy, athletic, musically inclined, slow learners, violent. How many of you came up with this racial group? The next one is religious fanatic, chauvinist, believe they're superior to other people, terrorist. How many of you came up with this racial group? Well, this is going to be hard because you only got two choices. Here you go. Stoic and shows no emotions, lives or lacks ambition to better themselves, live in harmony and understanding of nature, and has a problem with alcohol. How many of you came up with this racial group? And of course, the last one would be Latino. And what we're talking about is that default assumption that our minds automatically go to. Because if I ask you, what is the image of a coal miner that comes to your mind? If I ask you what gender would come to your mind, what would most of you probably saying? You probably would say a man. But that image is so thick. You not only see a man, you probably see a soot-covered face. You see somebody with a hard hat on and a light. That would be the automatic assumption. If I ask you what gender a nurse is, our default assumption would probably be a woman. And when we know that's certainly not the case. The CEOs, again, most of us think men, but again, that image is so powerful and so thick. We not only see a man, but we probably see a man of a certain age. We probably see a man with a certain hair color and from a certain generation. But all of those are called default assumptions. We know that there are not all men are coal miners. We know that not all nurses are females. And we know that all CEOs are not white men. But those are default assumptions that at play every day. Where do they come from? Some folks say truth. It's funny that I've heard that truth is truth until you discover a higher truth. They come from how and where you were raised and brought up, how you were socialized, how you were exposed to social identity groups, your friends that you associate. But biases are extremely subjectionable. So how do we inject objectivity into the process in our interactions and our decision making? I'm going to stop sharing this presentation for a minute and share with you a brief video that tells you how and why these default assumptions are so prevailing. 1 second, if I'm allowed to make this transition. See how you do, Jeffrey. I hope you can hear it. If not, somebody let me know.
It's not sharing.
Not sharing? Okay, hold on. Let me get to I got to get back to the share thing. Hold on. Thank you very much, whoever told me that. Get up there. There you go. Can you see that?
We can, yes.
All right, here we go.
Are all alike. You people are all alike. Person, female, Puerto Rican.
You're supposed to be playing. Why have you stopped? One second. I don't know what happened. 1 second. This is my last time trying it. If it doesn't work, we'll skip it. Nope. For some reason, it doesn't want to play. I apologize. But it was really a video about how commonplace the conversations that we have every day in our lives that oftentimes we're not aware of. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my presentation. I apologize. All right. So the next one. I'm sharing, right?
Yes,
Hello?
we can see you.
Okay, cool. All right.
Jeffrey, I have somebody asking if you could possibly share the link to that video with me, and I can include it in the follow-up email to the class.
Which video?
The one that wouldn't play just now.
It's actually a DVD. I wish I could.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's licensed and prioritized. But anyway, so this will kind of be an example of those default assumptions that take place. These two images went out during Katrina. They were a snapshot of a moment captured in time during Katrina, and there was no narrative assigned to these images that was sent to media outlets across the country. And these media outlets were responsible for providing narratives associated with these images. The top image says, a young man walks through chest-deep floodwaters after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. The bottom image says that two residents walk through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. And so you would have to ask yourself, if these images were just a snapshot of a moment, then what is the difference between these two images, and why would it be necessary to provide two separate narratives? And if you were willing to be honest, you would have to say the difference that is glaring is race. I'm not going to share that video. Stereotyping is, with missing data points, our minds begin to fill in the blanks with their beliefs and fears. In the absence of the data, we will make up our own stories. What are our stories that our minds most often make up? Is tell me who's good, who's bad, or who's unsafe. This is a video put out by Coca-Cola. These gentlemen have been rolled in a room in complete darkness, and they began to share their stories with the other participants around the table. And I want you to notice particularly how their minds began to fill in the blanks of the stories that are being shared by the individuals at the table.
Having met the band, I started with friends.
He's got long hair, but at work he ties it in a ponytail. Probably piercings.
I read a lot of books. I read cognitive psychology, behavioral science. I've spoken at TED Talks. Really? Wow.
You look nerdy. Like you think you're cool, but you're still a nerd. أكثر شيء مركز عليها التراث الإماراتي واللغة العربية.
And I also think he's going to come to work.
Yeah, even I felt that, yeah.
أنا وايد أحب الطبخ. دائما يعني معظم وقتي أطبخ في المطبخ. طبعا يعني في المطبخ.
He's mature, like he's like cheddar cheese.
You mean basically معفن. Extreme sports athlete. I skydive and pretty high risk activity for sure.
Because your actions speak louder than words, right?
Yeah.
God, dude, that's awesome. لا هوني surprise.
It was amazing when the lights came on and you get to realize who you're actually conversing with.
واستغربت أول شيء لأن أول شيء فتحت الليتات الحمراء وما رحت بس أشوف واحد جالس قدامي كلها تاتوز على وجهه. This was my expectation of you. This is what you really are.
فشفت شخص مثل هذا طريق ما بعد تكلم. You guys should be swapped. I didn't expect that.
The rocker was someone who I wouldn't expect to be, a heavy metal musician.
I should have these tattoos, not you, man.
Change.
الشاب اللي قبالي براسي كنت راسم صورة إنه هو راح يكون عربي كتير شكله. That's how you love it. When I saw Garrett on a wheelchair, I was completely taken aback. Hey man, come on. This guy's already there.
لما جت العلبة فتحته ما مكتوب عليه شيء ما مكتوب عليه كوكاكولا.
And the minute I turned around, I saw that labels أو الشعار أو المغلف أو التصميم هو بس للعلب مش للناس.
ترى واضحة يعني المفروض ما تحكم على الواحد بالشكل.
الشخص مو بلازم يعني ننتقده بشكله، لكن أول شيء نتعرف عليه عقب نقدر نقول كيف الشخص. It changes your mind, your perspective, your heart.
There's one thing I want you to notice in particular about that video. When the lights first came up and the gentleman in the wheelchair began to speak, he said these words. It was amazing when the lights came up and you were able to identify who you were conversing with. This training is designed to help you turn the light on, that you might realize who you're conversing with is a whole lot more than what you see standing before you or sitting before you. A stereotype is a generalization about a person or groups of persons. We develop stereotypes when we are unable or unwilling to obtain all of the information we need to make fair judgments about people or situations. And in the absence of the total picture, stereotypes in many cases allows us to fill in the blanks. Our society often innocently creates and perpetuates stereotypes, but these stereotypes can often lead to unfavorable discrimination and persecution, particularly when these stereotypes are unfavorable. Judging a person does not define who they are, it really defines who you are. All judging is us claiming our place of privilege. I'm better, or I know somebody who is better and more deserving than you. There are over 150 implicit biases. I'm only including a few in this training. One is the affinity bias. This is where we have the tendency to gravitate to folks who are more like us. I've been on multiple interview panels and that might be made up of a majority gender or race, and they can bring in candidate after candidate, and it isn't until they bring in a candidate that mirrors the majority makeup of the interviewing panel that this is what I call a spirit of familiarity comes into the room. And you can imagine the hiring manager making a statement like this: I hired her because she reminded me of my sister. Affinity bias. Confirmation bias. That is, if you have a belief, a sincerely held, deep belief, you will do everything in your power to find somebody to confirm your bias or your belief. This person could be the most problematic person inside of your organization because the confirmation bias is so powerful. Like if you notice the image, this is a person who believes the world is flat, and despite all of the other empirical evidence that might suggest otherwise, they are drawn to the piece that confirms their bias. And a person will run through your entire organization until they can find a person that can confirm their bias or the belief. I knew I wasn't the only person who felt that way about that individual. That's how powerful our biases are. Confirmation bias. The halo effect. These are individuals in our life who are responsible for our upbringing, teachers, influencers, who are out in the world today. This is called the halo effect, that you have so much confidence, so much trust in a person. There's no way that they could possibly have disseminated you improper information or led you down a road that maybe you shouldn't go to. Like this image here, Shaquille O'Neal is my man. I'm telling you, I got some gold powder in my bathroom right now, and some lotion as well. And now I see Shaquille is hustling Papa John pizza. I might order one tonight. That's that you have so much confidence, so much faith in a person that you're believing whatever they're putting down. The other one is perception bias. It's almost like that confirmation bias, that our biases are so strong that we hold on to them. Like you could not convince that kitty cat that he's not a lion. And so we have the tendency to believe that certain racial groups have more criminality associated with them, or their work ethic might be different. Those are called perception biases. The other one is the bandwagon bias. This is the one my mother and my grandmother would just love. So you're going to jump off the roof because everybody else did. This is that we're jumping on the latest, greatest thing without really thinking about it or the consequences. So I'd like to help you with some takeaways and some things that you can begin to put in place in your own life. So how do we recognize stereotyping? Really, there are three basic concepts that are contained in them. They imply that all people in the group are the same. They contain judgment. And stereotypes are so inflexible that when we meet somebody who is a stereotype buster, we will say, you ain't like the rest of them. These are 8 ways in which stereotypes are perpetuated through our organization in our own life. Like jokes, name calling, oversimplified statements. Well, the one that bothers me probably the most is point number 7. And you hear it all the time, that we're looking for qualified minority candidates or qualified female candidates or male candidates. Shouldn't every person who applies for every position simply be qualified? So again, before you speak, here's a simple scenario. Think. Is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? So again, some takeaways for you. 3 major areas if you want to check your bias and be and become more de-biased. 3 categories. One is this: be humble. You won't be surprised how many people that I've talked to are during the course of this training say that they don't have any biases. You have to be humble, put your ego aside, your assumptions and viewpoints and experience. You have to pause for self-reflection and analyze your assumptions, your behaviors and your experiences, and role model this behavior for others. I'm someone who considers myself enlightened and turned on when it comes to the issues of unconscious bias and how they affect our interactions. But I will get to work, and I got to work this one morning, dusk to dawn. It was still dark outside. And I saw 2 women jogging down the sidewalk on the sidewalk that I typically walked on. And I said to myself in that moment, I'm going to stay on this side of the sidewalk until these women pass so that they can feel safe. And when I got to my office and I sat down, I wanted to unpack why was that my thinking in that moment and in that instant. And I had to be real with myself as I began to do the self-reflection. And so as I thought about that, I said, Jeffrey, you made that decision not because you were a male, but because you were a Black male. And you know how a lot of people feel about encountering somebody like you in the dark. And I got mad at myself because I allowed my unconscious bias to infect my decisions in an unconscious manner. And here's what happened in that moment, and it happens every day in our lives. 1, I unfairly inflicted my unconscious bias on people who probably weren't thinking about me. 2, I self-limited myself to an opportunity and access. We can look inside of our organizations, inside of our community, and say, I don't see anybody in there that reflects or looks like me, so I shouldn't even try. We limit ourselves by our own unconscious bias. So don't be afraid to make conscious decisions on why you make decisions that you make. Then I'm going to ask you to be mindful. And you've heard this: practice, practice, practice makes perfect. Honest communication is a skill to be developed. And here's the last one. I don't know why I got all ones there. Be internally motivated. Accept the fact that you won't always say the right thing, but when you're internally motivated, you will try to be more conscious about it. Debiasing. Assume good intent and explain impact. I know you meant well, but that hurts. Ask questions if you don't understand. What do you mean? Interrupt and redirect. Please, let's not go there. Broaden your universal behavior. I think that could apply to anyone. Make it individual. Are you speaking of someone in particular when folks are using stereotype descriptors of people? The next one is decoupling. Put aside your own judgment, viewpoints, and biases to focus on what the person actually means. Again, ask whether you are being understanding and whether you are understanding correctly. Ask somebody, are you understanding where I'm coming from? Be open-minded to being challenged. Accept the person's understanding and retry if necessary. Suggest alternate ways of thinking and talking when you see others engaged in biased behavior. Stereotype replacers. These are those default assumptions. Recognize when your thinking seems to be driven by implicit attitudes and stereotypes. Label such things as bias when they come up in your interactions and conversations. Reflect on why this occurred in the first place. Where are those things coming from? Replace that thought with counter examples. I don't really believe that person is a good fit. Why are they not a good fit? Is it based on biases or is it based in reality? This is just a brief video that will kind of summarize this training for you.
Unconscious biases are those impressions that exist in our unconscious mind and unknowingly inform our opinions about people. When we make judgments about people, we all have biases. We are aware of many of them, but sometimes they are completely subconscious and reflect our cultural and social experiences. No matter how unbiased.
I don't know why we're having these difficulties. I apologize. Technology.
Unconscious biases are those impressions that exist in our unconscious mind and unknowingly inform our opinions about people. When we make judgments about people, we all have biases. We are aware of many of them, but sometimes they are completely subconscious and reflect our cultural and social experiences. No matter how unbiased we think we are, these aspects of human nature shape how we interact with people and how we make decisions. They are blind spots in our rational decision-making, and we are unaware that they exist. As one famous psychologist, Daniel Kahneman, said, "The brain is a machine for jumping to conclusions." We make judgments within seconds of meeting someone about everything from their competence to friendliness and even honesty. If we do not counter these preconceptions, we can make mistakes that jeopardize our working relationships and hinder teamwork and creativity. We live and work in a diverse society, so we must be aware that our subconscious biases and stereotypes can affect how we think and feel about people we come into contact with. Unconscious biases are those impressions that
So moving forward, redirect relationships between historical patterns of discrimination and today's inequity. Be open-minded to try different approaches. We've already covered that. Different people feel safe in different environments. Be willing to speak up as a champion for inclusion when you witness different situations, exclusionary behavior based on biases and discrimination. Be a champion. Embrace the gift of diversity. Realize the role of race, power, and justice in this country. Radical hospitality. Invite and listen to folks who are different from you. Trust building and commit to it. Trust is a whole lot more than just a word. You have to be able not only to talk, but walk the walk. Embrace the dissenters and protesters. And I don't mean those violent rioters. In most cases in this country, change really was wrought through dissenters and protesters. And then adapt the culture to change. Move to a more equitable model. A model that has been established on equity and inclusion. To have equitable outcomes that can promote racial healing and reconciliation and empower our agencies to do better work in multiple communities. Dr. King says, we will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of bad people, but watch this, from the appalling silence of good people. This is the last video I'm going to share with you, and then that'll bring us to the end of our training.
I am not black. I mean, that's what the world calls me, but it's not me. I didn't come out of my mother's womb saying, hey, everybody, I'm black. No, I was taught to be black. And you were taught to call me that, along with whatever you call yourself. It's just a label. See, from birth, the world force feeds us these labels. And eventually we all swallow them. We digest and accept the labels, never ever doubting them. But there's one problem. Labels are not you and labels are not me. Labels are just labels. But who we truly are is not skin deep. See, when I drive my car, no one would ever confuse the car for me. Well, when I drive my body, why do you confuse me for my body? It's my body. Get it? Not me. Let me break it down. See, our bodies are just cars that we operate and drive around. The dealership we call society decided to label mine the black edition, yours the Irish or white edition. And with no money down, 0% APR, and no test drive, we were forced to own these cars for the rest of our lives. Forgive me, but I fail to see the logic or pride in defining myself or judging another by the cars we drive. Because who we truly are is found inside. Listen, I'm not here to tell you how science has concluded that genetically we're all mixed and race in the human species doesn't exist, or how every historian knows that race was invented in the 15th century to divide people from each other and it has worked perfectly. No, I'm not here to lecture. I just want to ask one question. Who would you be if the world never gave you a label? Never gave you a box to check? Would you be white, black, Mexican, Asian, Native American, Middle Eastern, Indian? No, we would be one. We would be together. No longer living in the era of calling human beings black people or white people. These labels that will forever blind us from seeing a person for who they are, but instead seeing them through the judgmental, prejudicial, artificial filters of who we think they are. And when you let an artificial label define yourself, then my friend, you have chosen smallness over greatness and minimized yourself, confined and divided yourself from others. And it is an undeniable fact that where there is division, there will be conflict, and conflict starts wars. Therefore, every war has started over labels. It's always us versus them. So the answer to war, racism, sexism, and every other ism is so simple that every politician has missed it. It's the labels. We must rip them off. Isn't it funny how no baby is born racist, yet every baby cries when they hear the cries of another? No matter the gender, culture, or color, proving that deep down we were meant to connect and care for each other. That is our mission, and that is not my opinion. That is the truth. In a world that has sold us fiction, please listen. Labels only distort our vision, which is why half of those watching this will dismiss it or feel resistance and conflicted. But just remember, so did the caterpillar before it broke through its shell and became the magnificent butterfly. Well, these labels are our shells, and we must do the same thing so we can finally spread our wings. Human beings were not meant to be slapped with labels like groceries and supermarkets. DNA cannot be regulated by the FDA. We were meant to be free, and only until we remove them all and stop living and thinking so small will we be free to see ourselves and each other for who we truly are.
So I want to leave you with this as I prepare to leave you today. What is a mind that does not think? What is a heart that does not feel? What is a voice that does not speak? I'm merely going to ask, moving forward, on issues of equity, inclusion, and diversity, that you simply be heard. These are some implicit bias studies that you can take online if you want to see where you are, some research and other stuff. Diana, I don't know if you're there, but if there are any questions that were put into the chat section, we'll be able to answer those now if you would like.
We don't currently have any questions. I don't know if anybody has any, but they can feel free to add them to the Q&A, but we do not currently have any.
All right, fantastic then. If there are no questions then, this is my information. Again, my director has expressed that we are willing to provide this training if you make a request. This one is not always free. But depending on what your need is, certainly feel free to reach out to me at the Office of Human Rights, and we might be able to see what we can do and service you in the community. And so again, I am so appreciative of this time. I hope it's really hard when we don't have live audiences, but I hope that on some level that this training has resonated with you, that you might begin to be conscious of your unconscious thoughts and how they may affect your interactions and behaviors and decisions. And so with that, I will say thank you, and I will exit on that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I really appreciate you being here with us today. I really enjoyed the program myself, and I think somebody just made a comment that it was very eye-opening, so I believe that everybody that was here with us today also enjoyed the programming.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all, and have a great, great day.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.